Thank you. So, authenticity in craft. So the subtitle for this was, or is, how we craft characters that are believable, taking into account their speech, actions, and how they exist both on and off the page. However, I don't really want to start with a discussion on how to create dialogue that matches a certain region or what costumes people might have been wearing in a certain area. Instead, I want to talk about authentic characters as characters that are so believable that they seem real. British poet W.H. Auden once said that some writers confuse authenticity, which they ought always to aim at, with originality, which they should never bother with. The distinction that Auden draws between authenticity and originality is important for what I want to talk about today. Not to say that the two ideas are mutually exclusive, but I am in agreement with Auden, and I would argue that authenticity is far more important than originality. One can write something extraordinarily original, but without that ring of truth, if the story doesn't possess authenticity, then readers won't be inclined to empathize with the characters. And that's pretty much what we talk about when we talk about willing suspension of disbelief, right? Coleridge had coined this term, right? And it's the idea that we're willing to ignore the fact that what we're reading is not real, and that allows us to empathize with the characters until we're drawn into a story. In fact, this idea, this willing suspension of disbelief, or what I like to think of as plausible believability, results in the fictional paradox, or the paradox of fiction. And it works something like this. Most of us have real emotional responses to characters or events we know are fake. At the same time, in order for us to be affected, we have to believe that these characters really exist. But none of us, or very few of us, who understand that the events and characters are fake, simultaneously believe that they're real. So there's this, we want to believe that they're real, but we know that they're fake, and knowing they're fake, we can't believe that they're real. But in our brains, we're actually affected by these events in the same way that we're affected by real events. In fact, there was a recent study by the New School for Social Research in New York that found that, quote, reading literary fiction enhances the ability to detect and understand other people's emotions, a crucial skill in navigating social relationships. The key here is that it's literary fiction. It's not, the Hallmark variety. And that leads to the authenticity. The authenticity is what leads to empathy. But it's all a magic trick, right? Readers of fiction, like the audience of a magic show, are complicit in the illusion. While the reader is aware that the reality of the story is just smoke and mirrors, the reader wants to believe that the story is in fact real. It's not a far cry from an audience that knows a magician is tricking them and that the magic is fake. Right? We know it's just an illusion, and if we know the story behind the illusion, it shatters. But in fiction, in order to maintain the illusion, we as writers must craft characters in a way that is authentic. We have to craft characters that are believable by taking into account their speech and actions and their ability to exist both on and off the page. In our case, the smoke and mirrors is really our ability to create characters that speak and act authentically. And it's this authenticity that leads the reader to believe that the character exists both on and off the page. And I want to be clear here, when I say on and off the page, I mean it two different ways. I mean, on the one hand, the character has to seem to exist off the page like a pop-up. They have to seem to be real in a way that we might meet them on the street. But at the same time, I also mean that the reader must seem to exist off the page, as in when they're not in a scene. The character may not be written onto a page, but that doesn't mean they cease to exist. Much in the same way a character in a movie or play might walk off stage and we don't think, that guy no longer exists. Right? They continue to exist, they're just doing something else. So the idea then, or the question is, how as writers do we create those authentic characters? One component I would say is to revisit and reinvestigate that old saw, write what you know, which makes most writers groan in frustration. After all, if writers simply stuck to what they know, where would we get stories like Alice in Wonderland, or The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or The Hobbit, or even Lord of the Flies? It's worth mentioning that writing what we know is not relegated to writing merely what we have experienced. Simultaneously, I'd say it's worth noting that Alice or Bilbo Baggins or Piggy have authenticity that stems from the fact that we can empathize with them. Bilbo, for example, is reluctant and naive at the beginning of The Hobbit, which makes sense. He's just a small town hobbit who's never gotten into trouble and is about to go into the bad part of town. Really bad part. We can identify with the authenticity of his emotions and feelings, even if the originality of this story presents us with something that we have not seen or experienced. Orcs, hobbits, elves, all that stuff. But it's also worth mentioning that Tolkien, I don't know how you want to pronounce it, was a scholar and a linguist who created entire histories and languages for the Lord of the Rings, right, which stemmed out of his knowledge, or stemmed from his knowledge as a researcher and professor. But Tolkien's not the only one. Right? Hemingway is often pretty much criticized for having written too closely to that which was his own life. And it's no secret that his stories bear a rather significant similarity to his own life. The academic Timo Müller recently wrote an essay called The Uses of Authenticity, where he pretty much hails Hemingway as a sort of godfather for authenticity in writing. Müller says, posturing as an authentic writer served to distinguish Hemingway from the urbane bohemian. And I think it is that Hemingway was writing in an authentic way, drawing from his own life, that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. And Hemingway's not alone either. Those ranks can be filled with other writers such as J.D. Salinger, F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce, Ken Kesey, who wrote this. Anyway, all are writers who crafted writing based on their own experiences and realities. Although some might criticize these writers for having written too much from their experience, I'd say that's inevitable. Right? We can only write from our own experience. Although we also live in the information age, which means that, and there's a library right here, we can go and find out information that we need to supplement our characters. As the saying goes, actions speak louder than words, and when it comes to written work, the two can be almost equally weighted. Who would be interested in a story where all the characters act and speak the same? Where in real life do people all act and speak exactly the same? So I would say dialogue is one of the first places where we find authenticity, how the characters speak. What they say and how they say it indicates character. The challenge of dialogue is creating dialogue that is both real and authentic without seeming stilted or forced. There is a writing exercise that I really like, although it borders on creepy, which is to go into a public place and eavesdrop on somebody else's conversation and write down the conversation word for word. I assign this to students often, and I still do it myself, mostly because it's creepy. But it's also fun and interesting to realize what things people include in their dialogue in a story versus what we say. A character that peppers their speech with too many pauses, too many ums, too many likes, starts to sound a little shallow. And yet we all do this. We all pause and use hesitations in our speech. It's reductive to say that written dialogue appears exactly the same way as we speak one. Somebody had once called it dialogue the greatest hits of speech. We leave out a lot. And characters seem to always say exactly the right thing or exactly the wrong thing, whichever serves the scene best. So in writing, as writers, in the interest of bridging the gap between reality as reality and fictional reality, we often find it wise to cut out all the hesitations and pauses and all those things. At the same time, we're often aware that we as writers must use dialogue to advance the story. The authenticity is easily broken if the reader feels that dialogue exists solely to advance the story. There's an example that I really like. One of my favorite writers is Don DeLillo. I don't know, has anybody read The Body Arts by Don DeLillo? It's like, probably my favorite book of all time. At the beginning of the book, there are two characters, a recently married couple who have moved into a rented house. At the beginning of their day, there's a conversation between the two of them, and it works something like this. The woman says, "Weren't you going to tell me something?" He said, "What?" She says, "You just said something, I don't know, the house. It's not interesting, forget it." She says, "I don't want to forget it. It's not interesting, let me put it another way. It's boring." "You're still sitting there talking, tell me," she said. "It's an effort," he says. "It's like what?" "It's like pushing a boulder." She says, "You're sitting there talking." "Here," he said. "You said the house. Nothing about the house is boring. I like the house." And he says, "You like everything. You love everything. You're my happy home." There's a ring of authenticity to this, because in truth, we speak past each other all the time. We misunderstand each other. We decide to start a conversation and abandon it. And this bit of dialogue, which I have on my handout if you all are interested, I think shows the relationship between the two characters, while at the same time, the word-to-word, sentence-level dialogue is accurate. It seems believable. It seems like something that we might overhear. Couple bicker. "You were going to tell me something. What were you going to tell me?" "No, forget about that. I'll tell you." Right? It seems very natural and easy to believe. Ultimately, I think authenticity does not mean that things are written exactly as they have happened in the past, but in the way they could believably happen within an established world. At the beginning, I mentioned something like Alice in Wonderland. There's still authenticity to the story, even though it's a fantastic story. It exists in a fantastic world. Alice's exchange with the Cheshire Cat is still authentic because it plays by the rules that Lewis Carroll set up for that world. Even if authenticity is a bit of smoke and mirrors that will convince the reader that he or she is experiencing something real, it's far from easy to evoke. Authenticity hinges on our ability to create characters that live both on and off the page. Without a sense of authenticity, the reader lacks that necessary empathy. A study from the New School in New York, the idea was that literary fiction creates empathy. But I think it's really authenticity and the authenticity of literary fiction that leads to that empathy. And authenticity, I think, is also born out of honesty. It's a product of our ability to crib from our own experiences and invest ourselves as writers in our characters. And the two quotes I'm going to leave you with that I think drive this home for me. The author Milan Kundera once said that every character is an author's experimental self. In other words, every character that an author writes is a version of themselves. And the other quote is from Robert Frost, who said, "No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. No surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader." If we don't care as authors, then nobody else can.